Um, so my talk will be a mixture of theory and some comments on recent events in various countries in light of theory. There has to be some theory, right? I'm a professor, and you are students, so, but not too much. But before I go to the theory, let me see, make sure I keep track of time. Most likely I'll forget to look at the watch, but okay. So I'd like to start with some charts about real GDP in various nations. This goes back to about 1950. These are in, this is real GDP, so they're inflation adjusted. The best measures we have of total volume of output produced in the market economy in per capita in various years. These are 2005 dollars. So if you want to know how much they would correspond to today, then you would multiply this picture, each chart, by about 15 or 16%. The vertical scale goes to about 40,000, 2005 dollars. These are purchasing power parity adjusted, so that in theory they should be possible to compare, but not perfectly. But for my purpose, because there are such big differences across these countries, this will be perfect. So the types of countries are at the very top, the red line, the green line, United States and Canada. Modesty kept me from including my home country, Norway, in the picture. Then below those two countries, there are about 4 countries, Eastern Asian countries, that have grown very fast since about 1960 or 70. Hong Kong, Korea, Japan grew very fast until the early 90s. And then towards the bottom, but not the very bottom, 3 Latin American countries, Chile, Argentina, and Mexico. They have not grown nearly as fast. I did include you guys, Kazakhstan, and also your neighboring country, Azerbaijan, both resource-rich countries that seem to have managed their resources well. As you can see, a little difficulty in the beginning, but the growth in the past 10 or 15 years has been astounding. One thing to know is that this chart is not on proportional scale. They're in actual dollars, real dollars, so that a given slope low down in the picture, such as Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan, a given slope far down in the picture corresponds to a much larger growth rate per year than the same slope high up in the picture. Now, I would, as a tentative conclusion, say much of this difference is kind of astounding, and much of it must have to do with some countries have strong institutions, some countries not so strong. I should mention also that China is in the picture, and that's the very bottom one for most of it. Many are surprised to hear how low GDP per capita, and by the way, GDP corresponds to gross national income per capita as well. And so China has very low income per capita. There's all this talk about how China is about to become the largest country in the world. This is just a good example that if you multiply a very small number by a very large number, you can get a large number. Now, I could have showed pictures of Africa, and they are much more depressing. I could have shown 10 or 15 African countries, and on the vertical scale, I would only have needed to go to 5,000 or 6,000. Some African countries have GDP or income per capita under 1,000 per year. So, a little theory. So what is it that makes these countries grow? And especially in a sustainable fashion. There are always ups and downs, what we call the business cycle, but what makes them grow in a sustainable way? Well, this is the only equation I'll show you, and it's a very simple one in a sense, but it's an extremely important one. It's part of any macroeconomic model published in any journal these days. It's central to all of macroeconomics. It says that output, GDP, and this is real GDP, is a function of capital and labor inputs. Capital, K, labor, L. So K is the sum of all the factories, machines, office buildings, and so on, productive capacity in the nation. L is the labor input. And then in front of it is this letter Z, multiplying that function. And so the way it's written, it says that even if K and L doesn't change, a 1% increase in Z will correspond to a 1% increase in output. That's a pretty good approximation to what happens in the world. Now, what this tells us is that it tells us something about what's important for growth, namely these three things. Well, you may think that L can't grow much faster than population growth. It does. Maybe not much more, but it grows faster. One of the things I've heard coming to Kazakhstan I've been coming to this forum 4 previous times. I've heard that Kazakhstan has it's run into a bottleneck of the form that it's hard to find people with the right skills to keep the growth going at the same rate it has been. And so as a consequence, Kazakhstan has expanded the educational system fairly dramatically, as I can tell. And so all of you students are examples of how the L can grow faster than population. In other words, when the workforce becomes more skillful, more educated, could also be because some workers have learned by doing and so on, then L, the labor input, will grow faster than the population. But by and large, the big factors are Z and K. And I would say Z, the technological change, I forgot to say that technological change, I just tried to indicate at the bottom how important it is. It's bold-faced. There's a visual impression of how it's supposed to move over time. It's kind of what makes economies grow. Not by itself, because typically we need capital to take advantage of it. We need machines, we need productive capacity, we need office buildings, and so on, to take advantage of the technological change. Examples of Z, what goes into Z, could be development of new products, new ways of producing things, more efficient ways of producing things, those kinds of things. But as I said, to take advantage of it, we need investment in new capital, both physical capital. I mentioned all those examples, machines, office buildings, and so on, physical capital, but also human capital, which is what you students are in the process of accumulating. We call that human capital. And here's where a main focus on my talk will come into play, and I may as well mention it. Much of the focus will be on the role economic policy may have for the growth of nations. I submit that economic policy can have fairly dramatic effects, either positive or negative. I've listed a couple of examples. These happen to be countries I've studied myself, and I think these are both examples from which we can learn quite a bit. Argentina in the 1990s, early 2000s, Ireland in the same period. One is a positive example, one is a negative example, and I suppose you can guess which is which. Okay. Just give you a second to think about that. Now, Argentina is in fact a rather sorry example of economic policy. And it has come back to haunt them several times. Most recently in the 1980s, so badly that it's generally been called the lost decade. In that decade, GDP per capita dropped by over 20%. Astounding. Then Argentina grew for about 8 years, and then another drop by over 20%, this time in 4 years. 4 years, drop of 20%. Unbelievable. Now, I think much of what happens in Argentina has to do with this problem that I'm trying to explain here, and that's my second piece of theory. So my first piece of theory, the production function, and I should have emphasized that these key factors, the Z and the K, the decisions about whether to accumulate them or make them grow are very forward-looking decisions. These are, you're accumulating something that will last for years and years. A factor may last for 15 or 20 years. A new invention may bear fruit for 8 to 10 years. Forward-looking decisions. And so it's natural that you would have, in making those decisions, you would form an expectation. You would have a view about what future tax environment, future regulatory environment would be, and so on. So here's the second piece of theory. And I'm making it stylized or simplified in this slide in the sense that I'm thinking about the benevolent policymaker, one who has a way of quantifying welfare among citizens and tries to make welfare as high as possible. This benevolent policymaker then chooses policy being a plan for what to do today and into the indefinite future so as to make welfare as high as possible. And because of many these decisions that I talked about are forward-looking, that means that this benevolent policymaker takes into account the effect of the future portion of his plan on today's or earlier decisions. Well, that's really the reason for this problem that arises, namely that that plan is inconsistent over time. It turns out that suppose the policymaker made this plan that maximizes welfare. Suppose we go, now it's 2014, it's suppose we go to 2018, 4 years into the future. Suppose the objective, the welfare function, has not changed. Still, if the policymaker were to recalculate his plan, he would come up with a completely different plan. And the reason for that is the continuation of the plan from 2018 took into account the effect it had also on decisions in 2014, 15, 16, 17. But now those decisions are already made, and so there's no incentive any longer to take that into account in choosing the policy plan if you were to reevaluate it. So this suggests that, but that it's also the case if the policymaker gets tempted to do this, especially if it does over and over again, and that's my interpretation of what goes on in Argentina, that they have a very short-run view about policy. It can or will be very bad for society. So it suggests that it would be good to have a commitment mechanism, a way to commit government, the future government, to continue the original plan. Okay, so that's the theory. Now, in practice, of course, situation is not nearly as clean, but it's actually worse. Because if you think about policy the way it's conducted in reality, well, that's likely to push you towards this very short-run view that can be bad for society. So two things. First, where is this temptation to change policy most acute? Well, in these examples I talked about, accumulating something that lasts for a long time, human capital, physical capital, government debt. That's where the prediction would be, that's where the government would have the greatest temptation. For example, in an emergency to tax physical or human capital more heavily than the original optimal plan suggested. Or, and this is something for example, Latin American countries have been experts on, reneging on their debt through surprise inflations. Inflations that have been so high that we call them hyperinflations. Argentina in the 1980s was an example of that, but also Bolivia. I could name a few countries. But the next question a perceptive student would ask is, do we have examples of such commitment mechanisms? Well, I don't have time to talk about the first two. The gold standard and the currency board, which was something Argentina tried in the 90s, early 90s, but it didn't work. The most talked about example is independent central bank. So the idea is, if you have a benevolent head of the central bank, and the central bank is independent from political pressure, then chances are better that monetary policy will be good in the long run, transparent, and so on. Here's an indication of, so Argentina is one of the worst examples of the central bank not being independent. United States isn't too bad. The old Bundesbank used to be the master of consistency and transparency. in the United States, a sign that this is working well, that policy is consistent, is that the head is in charge for a fairly long time, maybe spanning more than one administration from the fiscal policy side. So an indication of that for the United States, if over the past 60 or 64 years, there have been only 12 heads of the central bank. The newly starting one, Janet Yellen, she's number 13. I went back in history of Argentine history and counted how many in Argentina. Since 1945, that's 68 years. The answer is 54. 54 heads. So the average head was in power for a year and a quarter. There was an especially tumultuous year, 2002, when the head changed 3 times in 1 year. There was a case about 3 or 4 years ago. The then head, Martin Redrado, had actually sat for 5 or 6 years, which is pretty good by Argentine standards. But then the head of the Argentine government, Cristina Kirchner Fernandez, wanted her hands on the central bank's reserves. The governor refused. Out he went. And he was replaced by another one who was willing to give up the reserves. The central government got its will. So, now, this is kind of an important point because all these 3 examples I had to do with the monetary policy. But for long-run growth, I think many, if not most economists would agree, fiscal policy is much more important than monetary policy. Monetary policy may be important in emergency situations, such as in 2008. Some good things were done in monetary policy, but it's really, in the long run, it's fiscal policy that matters, and it's hard to see how one can commit to good future fiscal policy the way an independent central bank does in the area of monetary policy. So now is a good time to take a look at a more concentrated part of the world, namely Europe. And I have a particular reason for doing so, as you'll see. We have 8 countries here, but 4 countries that are kind of there at the bottom of the picture quite consistently. Well above those 4 are 4 other countries, consistently above those 4 countries. The bottom ones are Greece, Ireland, Spain, and Italy, and the ones above are Germany, United Kingdom, and France, and Austria. Throw in Austria. Now, in 1990, something changes. One of those bottom 4 countries suddenly takes off, and within 10 years, it has jumped past all of these other 4 countries. Unbelievable. So that's Ireland, and you may wonder if anything special happened in around 1990 when this big growth started. Well, there was something important that happened. The government decided to make fiscal policy completely certain. They said, if you, as either a foreign or domestic company, if you set up shop in Ireland, this will be your tax rate in 1992, 1993, all the way to 2009. And I guess Ireland didn't have a history of tricking people, so this was believable, and it had an amazing effect. Unfortunately, well, one wishes the story had a better ending, because after about 10 or 12 years of this spectacular growth, banks in Ireland, which, by the way, were poorly regulated, they got tempted to issue loans, mortgage loans, construction loans, that were not very wise, it turned out. And they ran into big trouble in 2008. The government decided to bail them out at huge cost to taxpayer. But as you can see, Ireland is still well above those bottom 4 countries. So I guess it hurt mostly those who came on board late. So to me, Ireland is a good example of, if you can, you want to remove uncertainty about future economic policy, and that will be good for growth. What about these other countries at the bottom of the picture? Well, I didn't bother to include Greece. We already know that Greece went broke in 2008. They had to be helped big time. But these there were other countries that have been mentioned as potential problem countries that are part of the Eurozone. They include Italy, Spain, and Portugal. And of course, Ireland has also been mentioned from time to time because of what happened in 2008. The bailout of the banks and the huge increase in government debt that took place in Ireland. So this is a picture of Z. Remember the Z from the production function? The technology level. The best way to measure Z is, we call it total factor productivity. So at top left, we're Spain, top right, Italy, bottom left, Portugal, and bottom right, Ireland. And this is a shocking picture. I hope you realize that. It goes back to 1960 for all these countries. The straight line, now this is on proportional scale, so a straight line will correspond to a constant growth rate. The straight line in each of the charts indicates the average growth rate of TFP from 1960 to 1990, and then extended to the present. Well, as you can see, in 3 of these countries, basically, Z went flat. And if I move to a related variable, which is labor productivity, the amount of output produced per hour worked, it shows a similar story. That's very bad for these nations. By the way, you may wonder how Ireland looks in relation to these other 3 countries. In the case of TFP, total factor productivity, we cannot really compare them because these are indexes. But in the case of output per worker or output per hour worked, one can compare these 3 countries. And in fact, Ireland is about 45 to 50% above the other 3 countries, even today. Even after the problems Ireland experienced. So that suggests that Ireland is likely to do pretty well in the long run. But these other countries, so it has, since 2008, everything bad has been blamed on the financial crisis. And the suggestion has been that, well, if we can get the fiscal house in order, so to speak, everything will be, well, in English the expression is hunky-dory. I don't know if you know that one. Everything will be good. But this shows, and remember that these countries became members of the Eurozone in the late 90s. So these problems in these countries evidently started well before they became members of the Eurozone. This suggests to me that blaming it or paying attention only to the euro as a potential problem is only a red herring. You know that expression? A red herring means something that distracts from the actual explanation. And by the way, I think it's fair to say that these other three countries, they will continue to be in big trouble until they can figure out how to make those curves start sloping upwards again. If I have time, I may have a couple of suggestions for what they shouldn't do, but we'll see how far I get. Let me turn my attention to the United States for the following reason. So I kept telling you over and over again, decisions about capital accumulation, or capital formation, decisions about innovative activity are very forward-looking decisions. But you may kind of poo-poo that and think, well, that's probably true, but it may not be quantitatively important. So someone with whom I like to work, do research, Carlos Arazaga at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, we decided to do a model experiment that we loosely thought might have something to do with reality. We made the assumption that, well, let me first give you the background in real GDP per capita for the United States. Since 1947, when good data started to be collected, so this is also on proportional scale, so that a straight line, for example, the straight line you see, it corresponds to a constant growth rate. So that's actually the average growth rate of real GDP per capita from 1947 to 2007, and then extended to the present. Well, as you see, it works pretty well. The actual real GDP per capita bounces up and down, of course. That's what we call the business cycle. But you can see that most recoveries from recessions were pretty swift. So here's, for example, 1982, fairly swift recovery, so on. And then we come to 2008, which is astounding for two reasons: the magnitude of the drop and the slowness of the recovery. Let's blow up the last portion of that picture so that everything becomes clear. So this distance from the old trend is on the order of 12%. That's big time. That's a big time drop. And as I said, unlike previous recession, here we're moving further and further away from the old trend, as opposed to as normally one would expect to start moving back towards the old trend. So what Carlos and I, the experiment we did was to see how important the expectation about something happening far into the future could have on earlier decisions. We imagined that in 2008, businesses, in the face of a strongly growing debt to GDP ratio in the United States, lots of publicity about the growth of government debt, about the problems the government budget constraint will run into when the so-called baby boomers started to retire. In the United States, there was a big bulge in births after World War II. Lasted for maybe 15 years. They are called the baby boomers, and when they retire, they will imply a great demand on government resources, the government budget constraint. So all of that was talked about a lot in 2008, and it's natural to wonder who's going to pay for that eventually. The time and consistency insight is that most likely the temptation among policymakers would be to raise taxes on capital income. So Carlos and I made the slightly arbitrary, but not completely unrealistic assumption that in 2008, businesses expected that starting January 1st, 2013, and for 10 years, taxes would be raised enough to keep the debt from rising any further. That seems like not an unreasonable assumption. What did the model, and the model used was a standard growth model, standard model that is, all macroeconomic models are built around that kind of model. And here's an example of what the model said. This is what the model predicted in terms of investment. Investment dropped a lot. This was it's sometimes called an investment-driven recession, and investment has been slow to recover, just as or pretty much as the model predicted. I could have shown you more pictures. In the case of labor input, the model predicted a drop of about half as much as actually happened. So obviously there were other factors. We're not saying this was the only factor happening. The model predicts that consumption wouldn't fall very much, and that's also in line with what happened. And by the way, this is in the face of productivity, or not slowing down much, at least not initially. In previous recessions, it was always the case that there was a slowdown in the growth of the Z in productivity in the recession, but not this time. As I said, not initially. So far, I've already summarized this. So let me end by talking about, or making this point. So when I talked about the commitment mechanism and a problem of time inconsistency, I implied that it would be good to have consistent policy. Actually, on that slide I said optimal policy, but in daily terms I might translate that into good policy. Good policy, consistent policy, something that businesses and households can take into account in making their forward-looking decisions. But to me, consistent policy, I would argue, is not sufficient. It has to be good policy, not bad, consistent policy. And I think of policy in China as consistent as they come, but bad policy. I admit I haven't studied China that much. Personally, much of what I learned about China, I read in a paper published in the American Economic Review about 2 years ago, entitled Growing Like China. It was, one of the co-authors is another Norwegian economist, Kjetil Storesletten, with two co-authors. And what they showed is the degree of resource misallocation taking place in China as a consequence of lack of competition in the financial sector. So in China, almost all banks are state-owned. They favor the large state-owned companies. The state-owned companies have access to easy credit, and until recently, easy access to cheap labor. They did not need to worry much about making the Z rise in order to show considerable profits. Meantime, the drivers of economic developments in most countries, when they start succeeding, are the smaller companies, the entrepreneurs who have great ideas that they try to put in use. In China, very difficult to get the kind of credit to make those ideas come to fruition. As a consequence, they're often forced to save up in advance of their starting their company or implementing their ideas in one of the smaller companies. And they tend to get biased towards more labor-intensive activities than they otherwise would have. So this paper has fairly astounding estimates of the degree of misallocation taking place in China as a consequence. A good guess is that unless China opens up for more competition in the financial sector, this problem will come back to haunt them eventually. Well, I don't really have time to talk about this. I don't think this is just an example of, and I could tie it in with the countries in the Eurozone that have been in trouble. This is an example of two countries in the same situation where the banking system was in trouble in those countries and where the policymakers handle it differently. Chile quickly seizing the banks in trouble. In fact, banks accounted for half of the nation's deposits were illiquid. They determined which ones were viable for the long run. The rest were allowed to go under. And the remaining ones were privatized within 2 or 3 years. In Mexico, fairly similar situation, and they thought that if they did the same as Chile, the cost would be too heavy. And as you can see, the cost was heavy in Chile initially. The first 2 years, GDP dropped by about 20%, less so in Mexico, but in the longer run, Chile was in good shape, and Mexico took maybe 20 years to get back to the original level in 1982. This is a lesson for, at least this suggests something, that Spain, Portugal, and Italy ought to pay attention to. They ought to make sure there's a healthy, well-functioning banking system where the entrepreneurs can get credit to implement their ideas. Anyway, I did have some summary comments, but I've run out of time. Let me just tell you, well, my wife is a great connoisseur of what she regards as good statements about a particular topic, and her favorite summary remark is the middle one here. There's enough uncertainty in the world as is. We don't need more coming or rising from the government. Thank you very much.
Я Сапобекова Айдана, я студентка 3-го курса экономического факультета. Уважаемый Кидланд, у меня такой вопрос. Как вы оцениваете влияние политического кризиса на Украине на мировой кризис? Спасибо.
Well, we don't know yet how it's going to end. I happened to be president in Barcelona when a scientific organization there presented a book about the economy of Ukraine. So I learned a little bit about Ukraine, and Ukraine is an economy that needs to develop faster. The last thing they need is the kind of problems they have run into now. And I suppose from what I've read, at least lots of workers in the Ukraine have realized that, and maybe they will help to keep worse things from happening. It's kind of unpredictable what will happen, because there are all these issues about will trade embargoes be put in place, which all kinds of trade embargoes will be a negative thing for economic activity in many places. Will as much oil and gas be available, and that could be a negative factor. To quantify those, I mean, they will be a negative factor, but to quantify them, I mean, there's so much uncertainty about what's going to happen over some run that I would not dare try to put numbers on what could happen.
All right. I guess we can conclude now. And I would like to greatly and deeply thank all our speakers today, our Nobel Prize laureates, Mr. Maskin, Mr. Kidland, and Mr. Fitzgerald Smoot. And I have a present for Mr. Kidland, please.